We have our emails among the TAs. We're going to try to have a little more discussion this week and see if we can find different ways to discuss more. But anything beyond that? All right, we're discussing in this section political culture. This links with the last section on social movements, I would say most emphatically. In the shock, the cultural shock experienced on, shouted, argued over, most visibly with things like the US Capitol in January, the Occupy movement, Wall Street, spreading globally and internationally. Say the Russian arrests on the front page of newspapers today, the Hong Kong issues with the Chinese. That is, these active, visible street protests, sort of immediate challenges, are relatively new in especially Northwest Europe and North America, where the tradition of civility has, at least in the case of the Houses of Parliament, as codified by Joseph Schumpeter, trying to say, where do we get these views from? Then if you go to other things, you can find it in American high schools and others who've tried to codify this. Compromise. Those are challenged by the post-1968. A second component we have in post-68 is the combination of entertainment, having fun, having a rock concert become a political engagement. That started with Woody Guthrie in the Communist Party meetings of the 1930s, where they had folk music generally. But a book by a UCLA professor trying to codify this considers that was a failure in terms of numbers impacted. He really gives the major Western American mantle to Martin Luther King and the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s into the 70s, which had many components, but one of which was singing gospel, or I should not say gospel, singing more traditional Southern African American songs, and then hymns, and having a direct connection with religion, with Martin Luther King himself as a Baptist preacher, having this sense of moralism combined with mass television coverage, which gave then the incentive to the leaders, Martin Luther King and his advisors, to find cities, especially Southern racist cities with tough police departments that would make rhetorically powerful statements such as waving a branding iron, we're gonna let those people be treated by cattle, I mean, things like that. Then this was covered by the national television in ways that in Portland, Oregon, people were saying, oh my God, how can this be happening in America? Let's do something. And so that transformed the Southern small town racism conflict into national policy. In the 1965 Civil Rights Act was passed, which said, basically equal rights for everyone, reaffirming what was in the Civil War, if you will, but which was not implemented after the Civil War. But it was implemented more emphatically after 1965. That in turn then spread to other ethnic groups, the Irish, Poles, the elderly, women. And after 1968, as I mentioned, this combined with also entertainment. So you had stars, pop stars, singers, Joan Baez, one of the most important, and others who took stronger political alignments in ways that that the numbers dramatically increase. So whereas you could find this with a handful of people earlier, this has exploded in not only the US, but this style has then, in the last decade, been more and more visibly transported through social media, through Facebook, through not just television coverage, but active commentary. And that's visibly, this kind of transformation of showing how widespread this is documented in the book we put online by Chris Bail, B-A-I-L. Very talented study, multi-methods of looking at presidents of the United States and how when 9/11 occurred, Bush said, now be sure not to take this as an anti-Muslim action. There are thousands of Muslims in America. We support and work with them, and that is qualifying what he said. Contrast that with Trump. That is what Chris Bail does is to show an increasing anti-Muslim, or at least fewer statements qualifying and adding tolerance and collegiality than even the statements of presidents over the last 20, 30 years. How did this happen? This is what Bail studies with the building on social movement activities, building then on just a handful of them, becoming then social media activities. Then he has a study of social media, then becoming spread nationally to talk shows, more mainstream talk shows, and then having these be picked up by enough persons that congressmen, increasing in numbers, started to change their rhetoric with a case study of the content analysis of top elected officials. So he documents each of these kinds of steps across entire domains, which most social scientists ignore. That is, most social scientists go in with one little bit. They go to one meeting, or one type of meeting. They don't look at these big things and how they've transformed the whole kind of political culture. So I'm in this way linking through this example, this section of the course of political culture, of changing the rules of the game, if we use that as a quick definition of political culture. And how the rules of the game get changed, because these are not permanent by any means. And so these big changes that I'm pointing to are things which we want to say, where and why did these components of political culture emerge, and how have they been, what are some of the logics by which they've changed historically, that we can understand better the present and other locations globally. The one way to put this as well is that before 68 and 89, this kind of street activity was nevertheless present more in Southern Europe and in the street, and with some Asians among students in the more, the Asians have much longer histories than we do, so they've got more variations over time. But you had activist students like Mao as a student, was very, very active with the students who did not have this kind of compromising civility, which was part of the Tocquevillian political culture identified in the US. And as these street activities spread with the components that I've mentioned, the counter and the combination of these with elements of Martin Luther King's moralism, joining the street movements with a sense of right and wrong and the biblical origins, added a component that that Elazar stresses in terms of its more narrow history from the ancient Greeks and Jews through Switzerland, the Calvinist churches, and into New England. But that story is part of the narrow history of Calvinism, if you will. But if we go beyond that to the more, since 89 especially, these things are being challenged in the front pages of the newspapers all around the world. That is, we have an interpenetration inside China, inside Myanmar, inside France, where subcultures and subgroups are battling with each other in ways that make this more complicated. And the more visible ones are the primordial, that is, say, Polish Americans, African Americans. But the more complex newer ones are more lifestyle oriented: gays, feminists, human rights activists, rollerbladers, the elderly, elderly's combination. So what we're trying to begin to look at here in this section is what are some of the big chunks and the big ways of analyzing political cultures using some historical and broader perspectives that we'll identify. Alan Zhang, who was the teaching assistant last year, was very talented Chinese sociology student with lots of historical background. And he made one quick point. The West was important for China for two big things: the Italian Renaissance and 19th century Romantic nationalism. After that, China's doing okay on its own. Okay, think about that. The beginning and the end of West from that perspective is Italian Renaissance was innovation, creativity, using the arts, engaging the emotions to empower people. 19th century Romanticism with Wagner, with Nietzsche, with Stendhal, this took these views not just to the people in one top castle. These took the views to everyone. And so the egalitarianism of the 19th century spread these views about innovation and rights. So the French 1789 revolution, chop off the heads of those aristocrats, we're going to start a whole new society. And that had huge impact, which we're still living with today. But the roots of that went back, as Elazar stresses, to the ancient Greeks and the ancient Jews. Okay, so one point this makes is globalization is not just capitalism and Wall Street. Nor is it just democratic egalitarianism, although this is a critical point as well, in addition to and quite distinct from the economic. There are many other dimensions which are cultural, and let's look at a few of them here. Second point, analytically, hierarchy and egalitarianism are critical, but are not totally associated with any single type of regime, including colonialism. We'll talk about that a little more, but just to make the point that one way to understand, say, Spain in contrast to England is to look at what they did in their colonies and what they permitted. And the English were tolerant of Calvinist, so-called non-conformist ministers setting up churches. The Spanish, absolutely not. You'd imprison, you'd kill people who were not following the imposed style of the colonial administrators. In the British colonies, these were not colonial administrators. These were church people who went with their own money, their own organization. They built churches, and they taught people to read, and to read by using the Bible. Okay, point 3, if we want to add hierarchy, to the stress of Max Weber and Elazar on the Western individualistic market egalitarianism. That is, the moralistic appearance of the ancient Jewish prophets with an S was plural, not just Jesus. He was not alone. And they recurred with threats of military domination, destruction. So the hierarchy egalitarianism, as Vildovsky stresses, was a conflict, a big cultural conflict. So Elazar features three subtypes if we look at the American political cultures, but Vildovsky and Lipset stress in a one-word summary. What's that? Moralism. Even William Faulkner, the novelist, defined the American South, who I quoted last time, or his one-word, or his one-word summary was still moralism, but he put it, quote, moralism under the Southern sun, to contrast with the New England moralism. So the Southern sun for him implied more passion, more excitement, more energy, and that these combine in a more powerful mixture than what he would sometimes, maybe not he, but say Andrew Greeley would characterize the Protestants as cold, unlike the Catholics who were warmer. So when I pointed out that Faulkner's lead novel, Absalom, Absalom, included the hero who gave away his slaves, would not join the army of the Confederacy, and hid so his daughters fed him through the whole Civil War. And I then pointed to the literature which showed that lynching was prosecuted and punished in about half of the towns in the American South over the 19th and 20th centuries. That is, there was diversity within the South, and moralism was important in the case of the most important, one of the three most important novelists. So I contrasted the New Englander Nathaniel Hawthorne with Faulkner in this way to show how they criticized the dominant moralism within their own regions, but by showing that it was there, but they chose a deviant case, the adulteress in Salem, and the man who gave the anti-racist, if you will. I shouldn't say anti-racist. I mean, but Faulkner gives you tons of racism, but he shows the battles, the personal relationships, which are wrapped up in all of these things with subtlety and power and emotion in his novels, one after another. So he takes all types and they're battling with each other, black and white, young and old, etc. Others have said the only original thing in the US is how much evangelical religion has transformed politics. The Chicago Nobel laureate Robert Fogel, in his book, his book that gave him the Nobel Prize was called Time on the Cross, with that biblical sort of label. A later book was called The Fourth Great Awakening and the Future of Egalitarianism, argued that America's been moving cyclically toward greater equality, largely because of the influence of religion, especially evangelism. And so I'm citing him because he took he for most of his career was a Nobel economist, economic historian, but he was middle class Jewish New Yorker, but his wife was African American, and he was secular. He paid no attention to what she was doing on Sunday, but he knew she was going to all these meetings. So then at the end of his life, he sort of said, maybe maybe that what she's doing is important for her and for many others. So he started to study religion and its interpenetration with these things as the economic calculus, if you will, was transformed as people were spending more time not just working. The 19th century, people just worked huge numbers of hours. They were exhausted when they came home. We've had more leisure time since the end of the 19th century, continually, roughly, increasing. And as people have more potential leisure time, they can spend it in ways that change. And so it's increased a lot more since World War II. But this is what Fogel thus joins the reasons for saying the world has changed. And political culture linked with religion has become more and more important. This moralism is to contrast the US with the rest of the world. And it may be the single that is hamburgers, hot dogs, hamburgers come from Hamburg, Frankfurters come from Frankfurt. I mean, the things which many say are American, or that is, I even had a German colleague whose Santa Claus came from Coca-Cola Company. Okay, my point is, no, Santa Claus had an earlier major example in Germany. All right, so the point is, most of what foreigners see as visual Americanism is European. Very little is invented here, but one thing that was the importance of religion and the importance of evangelism. And this is the reason for the label of Lipset, American exceptionalism, that many of the processes analyzed in China or in France don't work in the US. And why not? And so Tocqueville stressed, I mean, that was a major focus at Tocqueville. Why is this place so different? Where does moralism come from? Let's look at probably one of the most serious studies after Tocqueville is Max Weber in his multiple books initiated. I mean, the brilliant insight was an essay which became the book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. But where did that come from? So he spent the rest of his career sort of filling that in, contrasting other countries, other time periods. And where did this sense of moral concern emerge? And for that, he has a full book called Ancient Judaism. And let me give you a quote. In the 9th century, the great kings of Mesopotamia, like those later of Egypt, once again resumed their expansionist policy. Syria became a theater of hitherto unprecedented military events. Does history repeat? Never before had the world experienced warfare of such frightfulness and magnitude as that practiced by the Assyrian kings. An impending gloom beclouded the political horizon. As impending doom, classical prophecy acquired its characteristic form, prophecy. The pre-exile prophets, from Amos to Jeremiah and Ezekiel, viewed through the eyes of the contemporary outsider, appeared to be, above all, political demagogues, and on occasion, pamphleteers. So the pamphlets of John Locke, of the English coffee houses, were there in the ancient Jews. Okay. Apparently, Isaiah preferred the public courtyard to the temple as a scene for his appearance. Finally, Jehovah commanded Jeremiah, quote, "Go thou into the streets of Jerusalem and speak in public," unquote. As a rule, however, the prophet personally confronted also the king and his family in the street, spoke in public, or though it was unusual, dictated his word to a disciple and had it circularized. The predominant concern of the prophet was the destiny of the state and the people. This concern always assumed the form of an emotional invective against its overlords. It is here that the term demagogue appeared for the first time in the records of history. Okay, so when the Christians and Jews were driven out of Jerusalem, many ended up in Rome, where this slave culture over the next few hundred years, slaves of the Roman emperors or Roman army, ironically grew into the Roman Catholic Church, the closest variation of an empire in the European Middle Ages. And these legacies surround us today in war and in peace. The main readings in the West are by social scientists. On the reading list, Elazar, Lipset, later Tocqueville. These emerged in confrontation with hierarchies that will a little bit here. This is the easiest way to see how dramatically different these cultures are. And sometimes many people, smart people, miss them. They say, oh no, it's the internet, it's money, it's the cell phone, and ignore everything else. To show how egalitarianism grew in part in reaction with battle and with hierarchy in such programs, as affirmative action, diversity today is a hot term, which continues this much older big theme of egalitarianism, heightened by the counterculture and more. It currently grips many Western institutions, from the central governments to art galleries to families. And analysts from Hegel to Vildovsky have stressed these conflicts as driving history. Point 2, to identify some cultural scenes dimensions that contrast with the main Western components or remain in some niches, while violently hierarchical, we have aspects of hierarchy that we'll talk a little bit more a bit later for right now. But I'm making the simple point that these writers, especially Elazar, who's the most deeply historical, stress the smaller, narrower Western tradition. And we want to, as in this course, we want to add more. What is there different about the non-Western perspectives? And I gave you a quick comment from Alan, but we'll have more. To be more global and contrast explicitly with a more Eurocentric version of world history, in the same spirit as Max Weber and Elazar, we want to explore these comparatively. That is, after Weber wrote The Protestant Ethic, to assess how much it applied globally, he did full books on the religion of India and China, asking why they did not precede the Europeans in the development of the modern world, as they were much older civilizations than the Europeans. They had much more development, Chinese invented all kinds of things. Point 5, to illustrate the options that can suppress or enhance these competing dimensions is what we'll do here. To show empirically how the British Empire succeeded by including talent from below, in contrast to the other European colonial empires who killed the critics. But the colonial administration permitted the Calvinists to build churches and to translate the Bible into Swahili and so forth. Point 6, to inform and relativize the questions of many today about how much Western values can and will spread globally or not. If the values are only products of technology, the answer is clear: ignore the non-Western values. But with ISIS and Muslim militant resistance in Europe, the fallacy of ignoring the non-Western values is clear. Middle East, etc. That is, we need to pay more attention if we want to think more globally to what are the underlying concerns that create an ISIS and more, and the subcultures, of course, within the West and elsewhere. Point 7, end with my general points. If you were a mayor or an advisor, what criteria for policies should groups like Amnesty International, the UN, UNESCO, the World Bank use to inform local specifics? These 3 country cases we're stressing in the course differ dramatically. Very briefly, France, since Francis I, I've talked about with the hierarchy. The hierarchy was explicit and valuably embraced by Francis I through Versailles, through Louis XIV, through the Louvre, which was the Parisian capital, which was replaced by Versailles. These were hugely successful, and the French combined culture, language, art to explicitly spread French values and power, military and economic domination, all combined together. China, after World War II, largely ignored and outlawed its own traditional culture and stressed the domestic domination via the Central Committee of the Communist Party and an export production to expand the economy with huge success. But in the 21st century, this brought a massive shift to domestic consumption in China, in the economy, and more political openness via the internet and more. We hear exceptions to this. So when Mao stressed how the president today in the Western press stresses that there's much more control with him than the previous presidents. However, one of my Chinese colleagues, when Trump was elected, said, the last 4 presidents of China, they've all been Trump-like guys, in the sense they want to be strong, dominant figures, and that hierarchical domination is a more visible ideal. So how to combine these? The US traditionally was isolated culturally and economically, and government minimized or opposed, in contrast to business foundations and civic groups. Government was opposed by many citizens and by the political culture, quote unquote, in contrast to business foundations, civic groups, which led in different arenas, different decision-making arenas, business, culture, and politics, with the local specific stressed. Technology and markets are often framed as policy drivers rather than government or culture. And this is being challenged in the 21st century, especially when the US deals with international connections from trade to the military to culture. So the US perspectives are confronted with dramatic opposition in places like Iran, Syria, Russia, Turkey. And these global changes are awkward to interpret using the 3 characteristics of national patterns. All right, I'm gonna skip over this a little bit. So Elazar, in the US context, starts with the classic Western individualistic history, stressing values, moralism, the Sermon on the Mount, Moses, inside. So his focus, and I've got some of his books here, but he has a 4-volume series. This is, I think this is volume 1. The Biblical Foundations and Jewish Expressions of Covenant and Polity historically. So it's called the volume 1 of the Covenant Tradition in Politics, which started with Max Weber's Ancient Prophets. And then this is volume 3 is on the Great Frontier and the Matrix of Federal Democracy. So that's the general label. but it's especially it's taken from the ancient Jews, and he shows that the Jews in ancient Egypt, had a new frontier, which is like the American frontier, and where there are other things like that, which show change, which challenge political cultures when you're in a desert and you have to reinvent who does what and the like. How much these historical patterns persist is controversial, but one way to see how they operate is to look at smaller regions and cities, including neighborhoods where cultural placemaking through the arts is a new theme and slogan, especially for Americans. And a dramatic example we feature in Latin Scenes, book in progress, where the 60s counterculture values challenge the ascetic New England Protestantism. And the Americans used to say, we are not a cafe culture. We're not a cafe society. Sitting and talking is immoral. You should always be doing good works. But with Starbucks and more, this has hugely changed. We have combined the cafe culture with the street political demonstrations, parades, protest marches that are more the Latin traditions of street activities and political protest, which has led even to changes in regimes in Cairo, Kiev, Hong Kong, Iraq, and Iran. Demonstrations in several Latin American countries, Asian countries, and populist voting, of course, from Trump, Macron, Brexit, tolerance in Hong Kong, and etc. Okay, if that's my general introduction to the section, let me pause here if anyone has any questions or comments. This is pretty general. We can discuss it after I talk a little bit. I'll talk a little bit more about Elazar. But anyone have any questions on what I've said right here so far? Maybe smaller factual kinds or more narrow things, and we can talk about everything in a minute or two. Okay, well, I'll push on. Let me mention some of the big ideas from the 50 books of Daniel Elazar. The simple big idea of Elazar is that culture is more stable and historically grounded, and it doesn't change. It gets carried by carriers on people's backs as they migrate from Israel to Rome, from Rome to England, or let's say the Netherlands, then they migrate to England, then they migrate to New England, then from New England they migrate out in the northern part of the US to Western Michigan and to Portland, Oregon. And that relative continuity is what is one big theme of Elazar. On the other hand, he recognizes that there's change. And so he came to me near the, say 10, 15 years ago and said, you know, you've been studying cultural change. I want to build on cultural change and link that with my theories of stability. Let's work on a book together. So we worked together for half a year, and he died. He had lymphoma, and he'd had polio and other problems from being a teenager onward. So he lived his life in a wheelchair. He also, he weighed over 200 pounds. So I remember particularly a San Francisco restaurant meeting where I rolled him up from the hotel, up one of those San Francisco hills about 9 blocks. And then the only thing that topped that was after the meal, I had to roll back down and not let the thing go. Okay, so he was in a wheelchair, but he was a global traveler. He would go and supervise elections in the Philippines under Marcos and say, you're stealing this election. We're going to turn you in, and et cetera, et cetera. So he did personal field work he got a PhD here in political theory. And his first job was at the University of Illinois in Urbana. And he wrote a book. I don't have my copy of it right here, but it talked about Urbana and Rockford in biblical terms. So you joined the world history that I'm mentioning here with these little towns in Illinois, and the contrasting big three cultures that he talked about are all found inside Illinois. He then came back and restudied these towns, I think 3 or 4 times, and wrote books on each of how they had changed, re-interviewed the same people, and this is all there. Okay, so how does he generalize about change? The biggest single concept is the frontier. That with frontier migration, you have people moving, say, from New England and claiming a new territory. And they partially bring that New England culture in contrast to people from the South who migrated west, and they carried their Southern culture with them. But that you still had, in creating this new territory, something like a covenant. Covenant is a big concept for him. It's a political, moralistic statement with biblical background, which tended to heighten the importance of democratic participation and more egalitarianism. That is, if you start from a near blank slate where everybody is on a horse or a carriage in Kansas or in Montana, this blank slate tends to equalize obligations, and the Greeks and the Israelites were the key examples leading to the core views of Western civilization. They also, the two also generated monotheism, which he links to the idea of progress. By contrast to the more cyclical views of history by most polytheistic civilizations, which worship many gods in their natural habitats. The Greeks and the Jews codified their philosophy and theology in the Bible. Then Philo, a Jew from the Hellenic city of Alexandria, Egypt, codified both into a single system adopted by Christianity, which became the core values of Western civilization for 1600 years, Elazar suggests, until Spinoza. Meanwhile, the Middle East and much of the large empires were continually changing with war. Egypt, Asia Minor, Babylonians, Persians, also in India and China, although their religions and the caste system persisted in most regions. These all speak to the durability of religion as core elements of civilization. Even Daniel Bell stresses this in his book on post-industrial society. And of course, Weber on the Calvinists. The next big phase, to simplify, was Martin Luther, who compromised with political leaders and became the leader of the state church in Germany and Scandinavia. Lutheranism. The top political leaders in Germany, or there was no Germany then, but say in Bavaria, could choose or at least review who would be the head of the Lutheran church in Bavaria. By contrast, Calvin, a young French Catholic priest, was more radical. He said, no, the people will choose the leaders of the church. Bottom up is what we will follow, not having national or political leaders choose our leaders. We will have the citizens themselves follow the word of God, and that will inform them to choose their aldermen, the term we still have ironically in this Calvinist Chicago. The Netherlands, England, and Switzerland were the major locations in Europe, and then when they were politically prosecuted, many went to New England. The frontier pattern covenants then continued with the arrival of these people in places like Plymouth, Massachusetts, would talk about, we have a covenant with God to create Plymouth and it will follow the 10 commandments in our laws and what we do. That's political moralism, in the same way that when Moses went on the mountain, God gave him the 10 commandments, which continue to define right and wrong in a moralistic style. He highlighted the continuing spirit of the frontier in suburbanization, excerpts where new covenants are continually redrawn. Okay, the core values as they continued were on page 110. Liberal democracy, empowerment of the individual. So I'm listing them briefly because these dovetail, but they're not quite exactly the same as in Lipset. So I'm just listing them here. Liberal democracy, empowerment of the individual. Those are the two things that Lipset really contrasts to choosing two. Reducing the government constraints on the individual to choose social goals, and recognition of every individual's civil rights. The syllabus asks how to explain the lack of diffusion of these ideas across most of the globe until very recently, and more recent efforts toward rapid change. Quick answer: globalization after the Cold War. So that is, these things which are not just local history of the Netherlands, these are now critical in China. So you have feminists, as we heard on last week, within China saying we're people too. We want to be treated equally. With the end of the Cold War, sorry, this is the okay. We've let me just briefly introduce Lipset, and then let's have some discussion. I'll stop there with Elazar, although we could go on. The simple point of Lipset is America is exceptional. It's an exceptional society. Got a little photo here of Marty Lipset. Get a flavor. I wish I had a photo of me pushing that wheelchair of Elazar, but I can't find any good videos of Elazar, alas. And then the old classic cover of the book. Okay, so page 19, the American Creed is 5 things, very close to Elazar, even though those two guys did not cite each other practically ever. I tried to overcome this with this people working separately, and I created a group of me, Lipset, Elazar, Vildovsky, and Engelhardt, and we would meet at initially just us. We were not on the programs of the professional meetings. We'd meet in hotel rooms because there were so few people who were really interested in this. And then gradually it grew and grew. Vildovsky became president of the American Political Science Association. And he then said, he then became more, let's say, authoritarian, and our group stopped trying to meet. But my point is, a lot of shared perspectives. So the Lipset list is 5. Who can name these? Anybody? Lipset's big 5 points in the book. Why is America different? Okay, good things for everybody to know and be able to. Yep, we have somebody with a hand.
Yeah, sorry, it's a liberty, egalitarianism, individualism, populism, and laissez-faire.
Right on. Okay, excellent. Why are these more important in the US? That is, why is America exceptional in that these are important? That's a little harder question, but he It's in the reading. What's he say? Anybody? This in a sense, well, maybe the sense is that he quotes Winston Churchill, who once gave vivid evidence to the difference between a national identity rooted in history, or we could say race and ethnicity, and one defined by ideology, in objecting to a proposal in 1940, beginning of the war, to outlaw anti-war, the anti-war Communist Party. And I will add, at the time, Lipset and Marty Lipset and Peter Rossi were both Marxists at City College in the 1940s. And when Pearl Harbor came along, 1941, Lipset and Rossi fought for a day. Should we join the army but we don't want to, because this is a capitalist war. This is just Lenin. These are global capitalists that are fighting to take over the world. How can we fight a war to defend Wall Street? And so Lipset said, I'm not going to join. Rossi joined the army at the end of the day. But the point is, so this example was a very personal issue for Lipset himself. So in 1940, in a speech to the House of Commons, Churchill said that as far as he knew, the Communist Party was composed of Englishmen, and he did not fear an Englishman. In Europe, nationality is related to community, and thus one cannot become un-English or un-Swedish, or if you're Chinese, you're ethnically Chinese. However, is America is defined only by values because we're all immigrants. Therefore, this ideological commitment, not a matter of birth, means that if you reject American values, you are un-American. And that's what led to the House Un-American Affairs Activities Committee, McCarthyism and the like. But it leads to the more visible stress on values to say, how is America different? Because we're not very different in terms of, as I say, the hamburgers, the hot dogs, the churches. I mean, you have all the same churches in Europe as well, but they're just more of these evangelical churches in the US, and they make for a difference. Okay, just one or two very big ideas, and then let's discuss. Another big one is is that people can join and become American if you memorize 20 or so things. Read some Abraham Lincoln and so forth. You can pass the exam. You can become an American just as you can act in an un-American way. You can't do that in France. Anybody who is born, you can't become French, even unless you're second generation. You can never, at least traditionally, you never could in the way that you can in the US. I've talked about the three migration streams: the New England, the Middle Atlantic, and the Southern, each of which migrated west across the US. And that those three migration streams show the continuity and the history in ways that they had partly a frontier, but so this is one example of people continuing these analyses, looking at the degree to which these measures of political culture, in fact, are empirically supported in the three regions. And so the Lipset does not use these regional differences. Lipset looks at an American amalgam of the three, especially, and most people who've done this, like Tocqueville, just leave out the South. They're talking mostly about New England and Middle Atlantic as a blend, and that tends to be politically dominant. So when the Clintons came to Washington, as Clinton was president, he and his wife were tried. I mean, they almost went to jail because they'd done things. They started to try to do things in Washington the way they did them in Arkansas, and that was okay. I'll just leave it at that. One big other point about Lipset is how to relate the two of these fundamental things, a sort of individual achievement. And so he had an earlier book on the roots of this, which was basically based on this conflict between and changes in political elections from presidents throughout the entire United States history. People who were more hierarchical, like John Adams from New England, versus Thomas Jefferson, who was a populist farmer. And so that battle, and then later on, Andrew Jackson, the populist, these views of having the more of the one than more of the other, as we have as well from Trump to Biden, elements of this are still there, of in a way that they imply that if any one leader goes too far in violating the views of many Americans, even if the Congressional Congress does not choose them as president, there's more of a normal distribution, a centrism in American politics. And one way to look at this is to even look at the extremes. If you look at, say, low income African Americans, and ask them a question, how much are you in favor of the government equalizing income or equalizing jobs? Then compare that with upper status Italians. Which is more in favor of using the government to equalize? The upper status Italians or the lower status African Americans? The Italians are more redistributive. So when we say we need to add more redistribution to American politics, you're fighting against people like Michael Jackson, Michael Jordan, who were I would say, living in Bronzeville, these are the models of African-American young teenagers. They want to be, they want to write a rap song. They want to, get a basketball so they do it so well, they'll be multimillionaires, or at least, even if you're not number one, you can still make, you can make several $1 million as a basketball player, which you can't just working in a normal office job. So especially the young men really capture that. But the point is, there's an aspiration toward meritocratic success the term widely used is the level playing field. We don't want to have everybody just earn the same amount by law. We want to be able to achieve. And that kind of conception, as I mentioned in this sort of survey, this does not appear in all the speeches of all the different groups, but if you keep looking, and comparing internationally, comparing regions, and even African Americans on the whole, I mean, that are compelling there. Okay, let me stop as I've given you some challenging things. We got 20 minutes roughly. Let's talk. Anything big, small, whatever.
Yeah, I had a question. So both Lipset and Elizalde seem to treat, Lipset treats values as pretty consistent throughout, the history of America. Elizalde treats culture as consistent. What are the mechanisms by which these core values for Lipset tend to proliferate? By what means do individualism, egalitarianism persist as core values of American society?
And the quick, simple answer is just socialization. The most people are like their parents. That's a quick answer. The next reading by Engelhardt, who's more of a social psychologist, will specify that it tends to be more the main values stressed when you're about 18 to 25, when you're really forming your political views and building your own personality. And so he adds the idea that if something is scarce in that particular time period for your personality development, you tend to want to have more of that. And if you're poor and you don't have food, then you want food. But once you've got enough food, clothing, and shelter, then you want things like beauty, the environment, egalitarianism, or animal rights, or feminism, for instance. And so these kinds of things take off more in terms of lifestyle. And so that's an age-specific kind of thing. Piaget, I mean, there's social psychologists have made this more refined, but that's the quick, simple answer. Put differently, there's another counterexample is a PhD here on the rise of the New Deal. Who voted for the New Deal in 1933 when we were in the middle of a recession, massive unemployment? Did you have Republicans change their view and vote for Franklin Roosevelt? Quick answer is no. The main reasons that the New Deal was elected was that some people turned out less and other people turned out more than they ever did before. And we had this in part with the Trump-Biden election, that we had a massive turnout at a much higher rate than in general, but both sides turned out at much higher rates. Whereas in 1933, the people who had been more on the conservative side did not turn out so much. So the New Deal was voted in mostly by turnout. What the point of that is, most people don't change their values over their lifetime. At least say from 25 to 60. Now some do. And where and how the arts can do that. So the arts can engage people emotionally in ways that can change you as an adult. And how that works is a powerful kind of process, because it refutes the Bourdieu kind of interpretation that, culture is just what the dominant classes impose on you. Follow up? That answer is, I'd say, generally from social psychology and about all kinds of culture, not just political culture. Nothing original to these. It's not original to these. Well, I mean, in a sense, okay. These two do not stress change except for a little bit with Lipset does, as I said, we alternate, but the dynamic of Lipset is really still one of continuity in a sense. If you got people in the middle, you tend to go a little further toward achievement, then a little more toward egalitarianism, president after president after president. And so that, but by contrast, the frontier implies things can change. And we are certainly also having substantial changes, especially since 1968 and 1989, in ways that we get this. But if we look at what's the change, a lot of this, as I'm talking about with Latin culture, street demonstrations are coming to America. We didn't invent street demonstrations. We didn't invent the prophets and moralism. Black Lives Matter is right out of the ancient prophets, and that's been there for over 2,000 years.
Yeah, just to follow up to that, one thing you mentioned is like the notion that culture is like imposed from the top down. There's a point where like Lipset mentions that like there are certain points at which like values kind of emerge by like, structural changes or like the way that structures are established. So how much then does he see, structures such as the, U.S. political system, in which it's primarily a two-party system, centrism is more emphasized than other countries, for example, is one thing he mentions. How much does he see that as affecting or like generating values, like structures of political systems, what we call like political opportunity in terms of social movements?
Good question. I have to think about that for a minute. Um, where and how has he used opportunity structure? Okay, yes. Good question. And then especially because I'll add, he personally went from being a Marxist in the 30s to addressing questions like this in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So he was at Berkeley. When he was at Berkeley, he did a book with an historian, sociologist, Reinhard Bendix, and the two of them, Bendix and Lipset, did a famous book on, it's called something like Social Mobility in Industrial Society. So they didn't look at little individual measures of demographic sort. They took big studies of Germany, France, England, the US, and said, if you were a blue collar worker in America or a blue collar worker in France, how likely are you to become the head of president of a corporation or to rise to a white collar job? That is to look at social mobility. And what was the dramatic finding of the book? That is, what were the differences between the main European countries and the U.S.? That's the big question they asked. And in a sense, you asked a bigger version, a part of that, and I'm giving you one important answer of Lipset. Was America exceptional in its mobility rating? Patterns. I mean, that's the Horatio Alger, the Michael Jordan basketball player, black basketball player. Michael, how'd you get all those baskets? His answer was, if I believe, I can achieve. Okay, the Michael Jordan answer is the Horatio Alger. I can do anything if I really want to. Okay. Did Lipset and Bendix find that in contrasting the US with the European countries? Do we have higher mobility rates the way our ideology says? Anybody, this is the Statue of Liberty, anybody can come here and do well, economically, politically, culturally, and so forth. Answer is no. They basically found quite similar patterns in the mobility rates both in Europe and the US. So that American exceptionalism was not, then there were qualifications that I can go into, but the big finding was, and before they did that book, I would say most people, including most social scientists, said the opposite. So Michael Jordan can say it, but Michael Jordan is not quite representative of everyone. But Lipset, in a sense, is saying, even if the mobility rates are not equal, the ideology is shared. And so the ideology that we should be able to be equal if we just have a playing field. We don't want the government to make totally, this is the Bismarckian, okay, so the critical policy correlation from corollary of this. What's the conception of the welfare state in continental Europe versus the US? The basic European conception comes from Bismarck around 1860s and 70s, basically the German model of Prussia. Then Germany said, everybody should have equal this, equal that, and so forth. So they measured equality with achievement and said the welfare state should make people more equal in terms of education, income, and we should help the poor by giving them more money, etc. The American, this is what Lipset and others developing the American conception of equality, is said, we don't want equal money, we want a level playing field. And so the two terms which are used by social scientists of equality of opportunity versus equality of achievement. So the Europeans then and today, and we still have both debated in the US, but equality of achievement says, for instance, how many of the jobs in corporations have broken the glass ceiling and have an equal number of women as on corporate boards, as presidents, as city council members. I mean, so that's an equality of achievement measure. An alternative is was there, where and how can you point to discrimination which prevented you from being elected or being successful? And so instead of saying just the fact that they're not women there, I mean, the argument of the equality of opportunity people says, use procedures that will punish discrimination, but don't punish people who don't want to be what you think maybe they should be. And Lipset goes into that in some detail. Especially in his later chapters, he has chapters on African Americans and Jews because they don't fit as well these characterizations he's making about Americans as a whole. So Elazar goes into regional differences. Lipset's outliers are in cases he has, and the third is on Japan. And Japan, in a sense, is the values, a strong version of some Asian values. So Lipset goes into these ethnic differences in ways that Elazar does regionally. Follow-ups by, these are great questions, Max, or anybody else want to build on Max's line here? I mean, you've read and you thought about clearly in ways that are great. And that is, you've joined this as well. I won't say what it's in your head, but I mean, you hear these things being challenged and what you see around you in the media, people shouting and talking on the media on all these things right now, especially with Trump, with Black Lives Matter, with Biden, the new administration. These are hot issues. How about the person selected to choose the Star-Spangled Banner in the Biden inauguration? Who was that? Big question for the final midterm exam. Who chose the person to sing, and what's the implication? Just how about the first part? Nobody knows who sang?
Was that Jennifer Lopez?
No.
Or Lady Gaga?
Yes, Lady Gaga. Okay, anybody want to comment? What are the implications in terms of political culture of choosing Lady Gaga to sing the Star-Spangled Banner?
People are probably more likely to tune in if they know that a big pop star is singing the Star-Spangled Banner versus apathy that they may feel for just a boring inauguration. Yes,
for sure. That's one factor. But how about another level? I mean, I'm sure there's more than one good, reasonable answer to this, but that's a good one. But that's a simpler one. I mean, but why her? How about irony? What does irony imply? Or the fashion term of campiness. Anybody want to bring that in and talk about it? Is Lady Gaga, does she make lots of videos where she's waving the American flag and singing the Star-Spangled Banner? No. She usually has fewer clothes on, or she wears wild clothes, which are fantastic. She had a enormous balloon dress, which was a little bit different from what the other people in the inauguration were wearing, but she was pretty normal but my point is, and well, let me add, could she sing, or can her work, could she come and perform in Russia? No, the Russians prohibit Lady Gaga from coming to Russia. She's dangerous. Is it feminism as analyzed in China? Not quite. So we've got ironic combinations of gender roles, of equality, of left and right socially and economically, of Republican and Democrat. So having a country singer star and Lady Gaga have people who have cultural subgroups represented through them of sort of the, I won't try to label them, but you can see them in these individuals in ways that even the Biden, I would say the Biden administration is trying to give multiple messages to more than one subgroup. That is how to deal with diversity when it comes to appointing people. I mean, that's terribly hard. So appointing her with that, the other quick thing is a little bit of an American specific thing. When people like Michael Jordan are saying, you know, we're going to beat you guys, you know, we've won this game. There's also an Americanism from baseball, I believe, which says the game isn't over until, what's the Americanism? Who can answer that? The game isn't over until what? The fat lady sings. Never heard that? Common American English American expression. Okay, so to choose, that is the classic baseball singers of the Star Spangled Banner at the end of the game were fat ladies, not seen as beauties. So to choose Lady Gaga as the fat lady incarnation, again, was another reason for being ironic. It's campy. Okay. Who else? Good comments so far? Any other reactions of trying to join these things with your own personal experiences and things that happen, and you see, and like Lady Gaga, and say, you know, why is that? You know, why did they choose her? The fact that she can't perform in Russia says something to the Russians who are looking at this as well. And people who know that she can't perform in Russia, who may live in Poland. Oh, Marissa, go ahead.
You had made a point earlier about like Italians and like lower class, like Black people, and then about like income distribution, but I didn't really understand it. Can you go over that again?
Sure. This was a standard question which is used in international surveys when you try to see, you know, how are Americans different from Italians, different from Russians, and so forth. And the see if I can put my finger on the item right here. Yeah, it's page 72, 73. It's discussed page 72, 73, 76. The table is on page page 75 of the, and 76, it's there. Question, three questions. The government should provide a job for everyone. 1, 2, the government should provide a decent standard of living for the unemployed. 3, the government should provide everyone with a guaranteed basic income. Then it shows 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns for the US, Britain, Germany, West Germany, Netherlands, and Italy. Then it breaks up each people in each of these countries by high income and low income. And that's where you can see the degree to which even low income, so that doesn't have the African Americans separate, but it shows the, it's elsewhere for African Americans, but basically what that shows is the degree to which Americans in general, that is low income Americans in general, should everyone have a guaranteed basic income. 31% of low income Americans say no. 80% of Italians say yes, low income. 53% of Italians say, high income Italians say yes, everyone should have a basic income, whereas low income Americans, only 33% say yes. That's the kind of finding I'm talking about, which he is stressing. And Lipset had a smart methodology of what he called look for deviant cases like low-income African Americans who say, no, I don't want a guaranteed income, and then studying them and understanding why do they say this? And the kinds of people who are particularly articulate on that are, say, Michael Jordan. And so Orlando Patterson is a leading African-American sociologist at Harvard, and he's done many books on similar themes on rap music, Jamaicans, how did rap develop, and the values and the styles of especially younger African-American men of why they refuse certain jobs, and that the concept of dissing, respect. I don't want to be dissed by that job. So Patterson has elaborated that a lot, for instance. And so related point is African-American women with college degrees earn roughly the same as white women with college degrees. Gender difference, but if you look at African-American men with college degrees, they're much lower than white men with college degrees. There's a big gender difference. And African-American women, in that sense, are succeeding economically much more than the men. So what's the difference in the gender role? Because they both presumably are subject to a lot of the same discrimination. Not all, but the point is it's not simply black face, low income. There are differences between the young men and the young women. And how do those illuminate these questions? As well as choosing, say, a top basketball player. So I'm saying, I'm not giving you answers. I'm saying these are avenues to try to interpret and understand better what's in the minds of the people who give these challenging answers that challenge what we see in the media, or what that is, they may challenge their own majority. But that's why I also brought in Nathaniel Hawthorne and Faulkner of saying they're criticizing and challenging the dominant view within New England or within the South, just as Michael Jordan is challenging as well. Okay, any quick follow-up on that, or is that Marissa?
Oh, sorry. No, that was good. Thank you.
Okay, why don't we quit for now? We'll continue in office hours with anybody who wants to. And again, we're going to try to stress more this week, having a longer period for discussion, and encourage you to think about, as you read, write in the column, write in the margin, or make notes of saying, I'm not so sure about that. And then let's talk about it. Okay, great. Office hours onward. Thank you for participation.